There was once a boy called Jack, and everyone inside of that village would know him as Idle Jack or Lazy Jack. For if he had the chance, he would lie in his bed until the cock crowed 11 and would only do as much work as he could get away with. His mother and he lived inside of a cottage, a poor cottage, and in that cottage they had barely enough to eat and barely enough to drink, and the only thing that they owned was a cow. And the cow, whose name was Milky White, they could take it and they could milk it, and with the milk the mother would make butter or she would make cheese, and this is what they would sell so that they had enough food upon their table. But one day, when Jack's mother went outside to milk Milky White, she found that the cow could no longer give any milk, and she called to Jack. "Jack!" she shouted. "Jack! Come here!" But Jack just turned over inside of his bed, for I've told you already his name was Idle Jack or Lazy Jack, and he would lie in his bed until the cock would crow till 11. But it was when she went inside of the house, she shook him in his bed. "Jack! Jack! You'll need to take our Milky White, and you'll need to go and take him, take him to the market and sell him. But make sure you get a good price for him." Jack just wanted to roll back over in his bed and go back to his sleep and his dreaming. But he looked at his mother, and she gave him a look that a mother can, that told him that he had better get out of his bed and do as his mother had asked him. In a short time, Jack was holding the halter that was tied around Milky White's neck and walking along the road. But this was too early for him to be walking. This was too early for him to do any work, and it was such a long way to go all the way to market that Jack's face had a downturned look upon its lips, when who should he see at a corner of the road but a man who was dressed all in green, a green hat upon his head, a green coat upon his back, green leggings and green shoes upon his feet. "Well, hello, Master Jack." Jack was surprised that this man seemed to know his name, but he spoke again. "Well, hello, Master Jack. That is a fine cow that you're carrying along this road, and I suppose you're taking it all of this long road to market. Well, I have something inside of this bag." And here he produced a bag, a small bag, no bigger than your fist, from out of his pocket, and held it up in front of Jack's eyes. "I have a bag here, and I am sure that inside of this bag I have something that will keep you rich till the end of your days, and I will give it to you in exchange for the cow." Jack knew that it was still a long way to go to the market, and if he was to sell it quickly, then he might be able to return to his bed, and if he was to bring something that would keep him rich till the end of his days, then his mother would be pleased as well. Without looking inside of the bag, Jack handed over the halter around Milky White's neck and grabbed hold of the bag. Inside of the bag he could feel that there was something small, and he thought that it must be pieces of gold or pieces of diamonds or coins or any number of different kinds of riches. And as this stranger, dressed all in green, walked away from him, he looked inside of the bag to see that it was filled with beans. 5 beans. Jack knew that this was not a good bargain, to swap a cow for 5 beans. But little did he know that they were magic beans. But as he ran to try and find the stranger, the halter, and Milky White had gone. And it was with a heavy heart that he knew that he must return to his home and give his mother what he had swapped Milky White for: 5 beans. His mother stood at the door. She was quite surprised to see him return. "Well, Jack, what have you got? What have you got for Milky White the cow? I hope you've got something that'll keep us rich for the end of our days." Jack heard these words and thought that he could tell her that he'd been given these beans, and he'd been told that they would keep him happy till the rest of his days, and he handed the bag to his mother. But his hands were shaking, his body trembled. His mother licked at her lips and held the bag. What's inside of here then? Diamonds? He shook his head. Rubies? He shook his head. Gold? He shook his head. And when she looked inside of the bag and saw that there was nothing more than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 beans, she screamed, Beans! Beans, you stupid boy! How can we live on 5 beans? She took the beans and threw them out the window and sent Jack to his bed without any supper. As he lay in his bed, he thought of what a fool he had been to swap the only thing that they possessed, milky white, for a bag of beans. Hungry and cold, he fell asleep, and he listened to the rain falling on the roof, and he wondered what the rest of his life would hold for him. The next morning, when the sun came up, he could tell that it was morning, for his room was bathed with a green light, and he looked out of his window, and what could he see but a huge leaf the size of a blanket that covered over his window, and the leaf was attached to a beanstalk, for during the night the rain had fallen, and these 5 magic beans had grown up way past the clouds, and Jack, without waiting for a single heartbeat, started to climb up that beanstalk and waved goodbye to his mother. His mother was sad to see him go, but there was nothing that was going to stop his curiosity as he climbed higher and higher up the beanstalk. And he climbed and he climbed and he climbed. And when he'd passed through those clouds, he saw that there was a road, a long, flat, straight road. Well, rather than climb back down again, Jack walked and he walked and he walked. And as he walked, he came to where there was a castle. A great castle with golden gates at its front and 2 huge wooden doors. The castle was white and wide, and he knocked upon the door once and twice and 3 times, and the door creaked open. And in the doorway there stood a woman. The tallest woman that Jack had ever seen in all of his life. She looked straight ahead and couldn't see him, for she was head and body and shoulders taller than he. She looked and said, "Who's there? Who's there? Who's there?" Jack put his 2 hands together, clasped them together, took a deep breath and went, "Please let me in. I have travelled far and wide, and I have come to this place, and I am hungry," for he'd had no supper. "I am hungry and tired. Please let me come in." This giant woman said, "Be off with you! Be off with you! My husband eats little boys like you. He'd eat you for breakfast. Go away!" And yet again, Jack took a huge breath. "Please let me in." He looked so sorrowful that the kind-hearted giant's wife let him come into the castle. She sat him down by the side of the giant's table, and on the giant's chair his feet did not reach the ground, but she brought him a thimbleful of milk, which was as big as a bucket. She brought for him a crumb of bread, which was as big as a football, and Jack greedily ate the bread and drank down the milk, but as he had finished he heard a thump, 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 thump. "Quick," said the giant's wife, "quick, you must go and hide in the oven, for if my husband sees you, he will eat you." Jack was placed inside of the oven, but the door wasn't fully closed, and he could see from a kick at the door as the door opened up and the giant stood there and sniffed the air. "Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." "Don't be so silly," said the giant's wife. "That's just the smell of your last meal. Oh, sit down." And without a please and without a thank you, the giant sat there as his wife brought him his food. and without the grace of using a knife or a fork, he plunged his fingers inside of the food and pushed it inside his mouth. All of the food dribbled down into his beard, and as his wife took away the plate, he roared, "Wife, wife, bring me my gold." Jack was intrigued when he heard the word gold, and he rubbed his hands together and crept ever closer to the mouth of the oven to look and see what he could see. The wife brought a bag as big as a room, and it clanked upon the table. The giant took out the coins and started to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. With the food in his belly, his eyes were starting to droop, and he started to count yet again. 1, 2, 3, 4. As the giant closed his eyes and began to snore, Jack gently opened up the oven door and crept out. And for all he was a lazy boy, he was a strong boy. And he put that bag upon his back and staggered out through the great gates at the front of the castle and ran along the white road that was above the clouds and scrambled right down and down and down and down to the bottom of the beanstalk. When he stood there, his mother looked at him and said, "What you got there then?" "You'll be very pleased when you see what I've got inside of this bag," replied Jack. As she opened up the bag, the smile upon her face grew wider and wider, and instead of shouting, "Beans!" this time she shouted, "Gold! Gold, you clever boy! You brought gold!" All of the fear for Jack climbing up that beanstalk was gone. On the next morning, Jack, who had a great curiosity inside of his heart, decided that he would climb up yet again up the beanstalk. And so he did. He climbed and he climbed and he climbed and he climbed until he felt as if he could climb no further. And along that road he walked and he walked and he walked and he walked till he came to the great castle. And here he knocked upon the door, once and twice and 3 times. The door creaked open. And again, the giant wife, she stood there at the door to the great castle. She looked straight ahead. "Who's there? Who's there? Who can it be?" Jack took a huge breath. "Please let me in." The giant's wife looked down and she said, "The last time I let somebody come into this castle, they stole the gold. They stole my husband's gold." But yet again, Jack pleaded, "Please let me in." And his tears ran down his cheeks like rivers and formed a diamond at the tip of his chin that fell to the floor. And that kind-hearted giant's wife let him come into the castle and sat him down. And just as he sat down, there was a great and a terrible thump, thump, thump upon the ground. And the giant's wife was, well, she was surprised to say the least. For without any bidding and without any telling, Jack went and hid in the oven. Just in time, for the door creaked open. And there stood the giant, with his long greasy hair hanging over his shoulders, and he sniffed the air and roared, 3, 5, 4, fun. I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread. "Don't be so silly," said his wife. "Just go and sit down and I'll bring you your supper." Jack was very curious indeed, and he looked and he watched as the giant ate without a word of please or a word of thank you or a knife and a fork in his hand, and he stuffed that food as it dribbled down his chin and fell onto his clothes. And this time, as the giant's wife took away that plate, he roared, "Wife, wife, bring me my hen." Jack looked and saw that a hen was brought, a hen that was as tall as a boy, but no different in shape or colour to any other hen that Jack had ever seen in all of his life. But as the giant roared, "Hen, hen, lay an egg for me," the hen laid a beautiful, round, shining, golden egg. An egg that was as long as your arm. And the giant roared yet again, "Hen, hen, lay an egg for me." But his eyes were drooping, and another egg was laid. And another. But the giant's eyes were getting heavy, and he folded his arms and laid his head upon his arms and fell into a deep sleep. Jack crept from out of the oven, grabbed hold of that bird by its legs and held its beak and threw it over his shoulder, and he ran out of the great gates at the front and along the road and down the Beanstalk, and his mother looked, and she was surprised to see a hen that was as tall as a boy. But when Jack said, "Go on, hen, hen, lay an egg for me," and the hen dutifully laid a beautiful, round, shining, golden egg. Jack and his mother lived very well with the golden coins and the golden egg, for many people would travel from miles around to come and see the huge coins, or to gasp in wonderment to see the hen lay golden eggs. But Jack had a curiosity inside of his heart, and he decided that he would go up the Beanstalk again. Before anyone had raised themselves from out of their beds, Jack decided that he would go up the Beanstalk. And up he climbed, further and further, and he climbed and he climbed, and when he got to the road he walked and he walked and he walked, and when he got to that great castle he knocked once and twice and 3 times upon the door, and the door creaked open. And there stood the giant's wife, and when she could see no one in front of her, she immediately looked down. "Go away! Go away! Every time I let a little boy into my castle, they steal our treasures! Go away!" But Jack had such a sorrowful look in his eye, such a downcast turn to his mouth. His shoulders were sunken, and he took a deep breath and went, "Please let me in." That the giant's wife took pity upon him and brought him in and sat him at the table. But no sooner had he sat down with his legs dangling at the giant's table than there was the great thump, thump, thump upon the ground, and yet again Jack went and hid inside of the oven, and this time as the door opened, the giant had a murderous look in his eye, and he looked around and sniffed the air. "If I fall from, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Be he alive or be he dead,
I'll grind his bones to make my bread.
Don't be so silly, said the giant's wife. It's just the smell of your last meal. Sit down and I'll bring the food to you. And this time the giant didn't even have the grace to use his fingers, for he tipped up the plate and poured it down his throat. Jack watched, and as the plate was taken away, this time, in a bad temper, the giant spoke to his wife.
Wife, bring me my harp, for I have an anger in my heart.
Jack was curious as he watched his wife bring a harp that had a beautiful face at its front. It had eyes and nose and lips and ears and hair, and it was covered all over in gold. It had gems of diamonds and rubies and sapphires. And Jack watched as the giant, without raising his finger, brought music into the room by just saying to the harp,
Harp, harp, play for me.
The sweetest music that any man has ever heard raised itself up into the air. It wrapped itself about Jack's heart, and he felt so calm that he knew that the harp would have to be his. The giant, who had nothing else but anger in his blood, took some time before he fell asleep, but still the harp sang and played its beautiful music. Jack crept slowly from out of the oven, and he went over to the harp and looked at its beautiful face. But as he picked it up, that harp yelled, Master! 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 I am being stolen by Jack! The giant woke up. The anger in his blood and the fury in his heart was soon down by his side and in his hands, for he reached for a huge sharp sword. Jack, with the harp underneath his arm, started to run, and the giant threw a rusty sword towards Jack, and the swords clashed and rattled and clanged in the air, and the giant knocked the rusty sword from out of Jack's hand. But Jack ran on, out of the castle and out through the gates and along the road, and all Jack could hear was the thump, 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 thump of the giant's feet upon the ground. And he ran along that road, and all he could feel was the hot breath of the giant upon his neck. Jack ran on. He got to the top of the beanstalk, and still with the harp singing and shouting for its master, he climbed down the beanstalk. When he was halfway down, he could see that the giant was close to the top of the beanstalk and was starting to climb down after him. The beanstalk swayed from one side to the other. Jack had a fear inside of him that he had never felt before. His tongue was salty and dry, and if he'd been standing, then his knees would have shook and shivered. But now all he did was shout to his mother to bring him an axe. Mother! Mother, bring me an axe! She didn't question for one single moment. And he raised that axe as he stood at the bottom of the beanstalk, and he chopped, and he chopped, and he chopped, and he chopped his way right through that beanstalk, and the beanstalk fell with a great and a terrible crash upon the ground, and the giant fell with it. And that was the end of the giant. And Jack and his mother lived very well, with the golden coins, and the hen that would lay the golden eggs, and the harp that would sing so sweetly. In the days of King Alfred, there lived a poor woman whose cottage was situated in a remote country village, a great many miles from London. She had been a widow for some years and had an only child named Jack, whom she indulged to a fault. The consequence of her blind partiality was that Jack did not pay the least attention to anything she said, but was lazy, indolent, careless and extravagant. His follies were not owing to a bad disposition, but that his mother had never checked him. By degrees, she disposed of all she possessed. Scarcely anything remained but a cow. The poor woman one day met Jack with tears in her eyes. Her distress was great, and for the first time in her life, she could not help reproaching him, saying, "Indeed, dear son, you have at last brought me to beggary and ruin. I have no money enough to purchase food for another day. Nothing remains for me but to sell my cow. I am very sorry to part with her. It grieves me sadly, but we must not starve." For 5 minutes, Jack felt a degree of remorse, but it was soon over, as he asked his mother to let him sell the cow at the next village. As he was going along, he met a butcher, who inquired why he was driving the cow from his home. Jack replied that it was his intention to sell it. The butcher held some curious beans in his hat. They were of various colours and attracted Jack's notice. This did not pass unnoticed by the butcher, who, knowing Jack's easy temper, thought now was the time to take advantage of it, and determined not to let slip so good an opportunity, and he asked what was the price of the cow, offering, at the same time, all the beans in his hat for her. The silly boy could not express his pleasure at what he supposed to be so great an offer. The bargain was struck instantly, and the cow exchanged for a few paltry beans. Jack made the best of his way home, calling aloud to his mother before he reached the house, thinking to surprise her. When she saw the beans and heard Jack's account, her patience quite forsook her. She kicked the beans away in a passion. They flew in all directions. Some were scattered into the garden. The poor woman reflected on her great loss and was quite in despair. Not having anything to eat, they both went supperless to bed. Jack awoke very early in the morning, and seeing something uncommon from the window of his bedchamber, ran downstairs into the garden, where he soon discovered that some of the beans had taken root and sprung up surprisingly. The stalks were of an immense thickness, and had so entwined that they had formed a ladder nearly like a chain in appearance. Looking upwards, he could not discern the top. It appeared to be lost in the clouds. He tried it, found it firm and not to be shaken. He quickly formed the resolution of endeavouring to climb up to the top in order to seek his fortune, and ran to tell his mother just what he was going to do, not doubting that she would be equally pleased with himself. She declared that he should not go, said that he would break her heart, entreated and threatened, but all in vain. Jack set out and, after climbing for some hours, reached the top of the beanstalk, tired and quite exhausted. Looking around, he found himself in a strange country. It appeared to be a desert, quite barren, not a tree, shrub, house or living creature to be seen. Here and there were scattered fragments of unhewn stone, and at unequal distances, small heaps of earth were loosely thrown together. Jack seated himself pensively upon a block of stone, thought of his mother, and reflected with sorrow on his disobedience in climbing the beanstalk against her wishes. He concluded that he must now die with hunger. However, he walked on, hoping to see a house where he might beg something to eat and drink. Presently, an infirm-looking woman appeared at a distance, and as she approached, he saw that she was old. Her skin was much wrinkled, and her tattered garments proved poverty. She spoke to Jack, inquiring how he came there. He related the circumstances of the beanstalk. She then asked if he recollected his father. He replied that he did not, and added that there must be some mystery relating to his father, for he had frequently asked his mother who his father was, but that she had always burst into tears and appeared violently agitated, nor did she recover herself for some days after. One thing, however, he could not avoid observing upon these occasions, which was that she always carefully avoided answering him, and even seemed afraid of speaking, as if there were some secret connected with his father's history which she must not disclose. The old woman replied, "I will reveal the whole story. Your mother must not, but before I begin, I require a solemn promise on your part to do what I command. I am a fairy, and if you do not perform exactly what I desire, your mother and yourself shall both be destroyed." Jack was frightened at the old woman's menaces, and promised to fulfill her injunctions exactly. And the fairy thus addressed him: "Your father was a rich man, his disposition remarkably benevolent. He was very good to the poor, and constantly relieving them. He made it a rule never to let a day pass without doing a kindness to some person. On one particular day of the week, he kept open house, and invited only those who were reduced and had lived well. He always presided himself, and did all in his power to render his guests comfortable. The rich and the great were not invited. The servants were all happy, and greatly attached to their master and mistress. Your father, though only a private gentleman, was as rich as a prince, and he deserved all he possessed, for he only lived to do good. Such a man was soon known and talked of. A giant lived a great many miles off. This man was altogether as wicked as your father was good. He was in his heart envious, covetous, and cruel, but he had the art of concealing those vices. He was poor, and wished to enrich himself at any rate. Hearing your father spoken of, he was determined to become acquainted with him, hoping to ingratiate himself into your father's favour. He removed quickly into your neighbourhood, caused it to be reported that he was a gentleman who had just lost all he possessed by an earthquake, and found it difficult to escape with his life. His wife was with him. Your father gave credit to his story and pitied him. He gave him handsome apartments in his own house, and caused himself and his wife to be treated like visitors of consequence, little imagining that the giant was meditating a horrible return for all of the good things that your father would do for him. Things went on in this way for some time, the giant becoming daily more impatient to put his plan into execution. At last, a favourable opportunity presented itself. Your father's house was at some distance from the seashore, but with a good glass the coast could be seen distinctly. The giant was one day using the telescope. The wind was very high. He saw a fleet of ships in distress off the rocks. He hastened to your father, mentioning the circumstances, and eagerly requested he would send all of the servants he could spare to relieve the sufferers. Everyone was instantly dispatched, except the porter and your nurse. The giant then joined your father in the study and appeared to be delighted. He really was so. Your father recommended a favourite book and was handing it down. The giant took the opportunity and stabbed him. He instantly fell dead. The giant left the body, found the porter and the nurse, and presently dispatched them. You were then only 3 months old. Your mother had you in her arms in a remote part of the house, and was ignorant of what was going on. She went into the study, but how was she shocked on discovering your father a dead body, a corpse, lying in his blood. She was stupefied with horror and grief, and could not move. The giant who was looking for her found her in that state and hastened to serve her and you as he had done her husband. But she fell at his feet and in a pathetic manner besought him to spare your life and hers. The cruel giant for a short time was struck with remorse and sadness and spared your life and hers. But first he made her swear solemnly that she never would inform you of who your father was or answer any questions concerning him, assuring her that if she did, he would certainly discover her and put both of you to death in the most cruel manner. Your mother took you in her arms and fled as quickly as possible. She was scarcely gone when the giant repented that he had suffered her to live and to escape. He would have gone after her instantly, but he had his own safety to provide for, as it was necessary he should be gone before the servants returned. Having gained your father's confidence, he knew where to find all his treasure. He soon loaded himself and his wife, set the house on fire in several places, and when the servants returned, the house was burned down to the ground. Your poor mother, forlorn, abandoned and forsaken, wandered with you a great many miles from the scene of desolation. Fear added to her haste. She settled in the cottage where you were brought up, and it was entirely owing to her fear of the giant that she has never mentioned your father to you. I became your father's guardian at his birth, but the fairies have laws by which they are subject to as well as mortal men. A short time before the giant went to your father's, I transgressed. I broke those rules, and my punishment was a total suspension of power for a limited time, an unfortunate circumstance, as it prevented me saving your father. The day on which you met the butcher, as you went to sell your mother's cow, my power was restored. It was I who secretly prompted you to take the beans in exchange for your cow. By my power, the beanstalk grew to so great a height and formed a ladder. I need not add that I inspired you with a strong desire to go up the ladder. The giant lives in this country. You are the person appointed to punish him for all of his wickedness. You will have dangers and difficulties to encounter, but you must persevere in avenging the death of your father, or you will not prosper in anything that you do, but always be miserable. As to the giant's possessions, you may seize upon all without any fear, for everything he has is yours, though now you are unjustly deprived of it. One thing I strictly charge you, one thing I tell you to do: never let your mother be made acquainted with your journeys beforehand. The thought of what you will have to go through would kill her, for she has not yet thoroughly overcome the fright she encountered at your father's death. Go along the direct road. You will soon see the house where your cruel enemy lives. Remember the severe punishment that awaits you if you disobey my commands. So saying, the fairy disappeared, leaving Jack to pursue his journey. He walked until after sunset, and soon, to his great joy, espied a large mansion. A plain-looking woman was standing at the door, and he spoke to her, begging she would give him a morsel of bread and a night's lodging. She was very surprised to see him, and said it was quite uncommon to see a human being near their house, for it was well known that her husband was a large and powerful giant, that he would never eat anything but human flesh and blood if he could possibly get it, and that he did not think anything of walking 50 miles to get it. Usually he would be out all day for the purpose just of getting something to eat. This story, this account, terrified Jack, But he still hoped to elude the giant, and therefore, again, he entreated the woman to take him in for one night only and hide him in the oven. The good woman at last suffered herself to be persuaded, for she was of a compassionate disposition. She gave him plenty to eat and drink, and took him into the house. First, they entered a large hall, magnificently furnished. Then they passed through several spacious rooms, all in the same style of grandeur, though they appeared to be broken, forsaken, and desolate. A long gallery was next. It was very dark, just light enough to show that instead of a wall on one side, there was a grating of iron which parted off a dismal dungeon, from whence issued the groans of those poor victims whom the giant had reserved in that jail for his own voracious appetite. Poor Jack was half dead with fear, and would have given the world to be with his mother again, but he feared he could never be, for he gave himself up for lost, and now mistrusted the good woman. At the farther end of the gallery there was a winding staircase, which led them into a spacious kitchen. A very good fire was burning in the grate, and Jack, not seeing anything to make him uncomfortable, soon forgot his fears. He was just beginning to enjoy himself when he was aroused by a loud knocking at the street door. The giant's wife ran to secure him in the oven, and then made what haste she could to let her husband in. And Jack heard him accost her in a voice like thunder, saying,
"Wife, I smell fresh meat."
"Oh, my dear," she replied, "it is nothing but the people in the dungeon." The giant appeared to believe her, and walked downstairs into the very kitchen where poor Jack was, who shook, who trembled, and was more terrified than he had yet been. At last, the monster seated himself quietly by the fireside, whilst his wife prepared supper. By degrees, Jack recovered himself sufficiently to look at the giant through a crevice by the door. He was astonished to see how much he devoured, and thought he would never be done eating and drinking. When supper was ended, the giant desired his wife to bring him his hen. A very beautiful hen was brought and placed upon the table before him. Jack's curiosity was very great to see what would happen. He observed that every time the giant said, "Lay," the hen laid an egg of solid gold. The giant amused himself a long time with the hen. Meanwhile, his wife went to bed. At length, the giant fell asleep by the fireside and snored like the roaring of a cannon. At daybreak, Jack, finding the giant not likely to soon be awoken, crept softly out of his hiding place, seized the hen, and ran off with her. He met with some difficulty in finding his way out of the house, but at last he reached the road in safety without fear of pursuit. He easily found the way to the Beanstalk, and descended it better and quicker than he expected. His mother was overjoyed to see him. He found her crying bitterly and lamenting his fate, for she concluded he had come to a shocking end through his bravery and foolishness and rashness. Jack was impatient to show her the hen, and informed his mother how valuable it was. "And now, mother," said Jack, "I have brought home that which will quickly make you rich without any trouble. I hope I have made some amends for all of the affliction I have caused you through my laziness, idleness, extravagance, and foolishness." The hen produced them as many eggs as they desired. They sold them, and in a little time became very rich. For some months, Jack and his mother lived happily together, but he, being very curious, longed to climb the beanstalk and pay the giant another visit in order to carry off some more of his treasures. For during the time Jack was in the giant's mansion, whilst he lay concealed in the oven, he learned from the conversation which took place between the giant and his wife that he possessed some very rich curiosities. Jack thought on his journey again and again and again, but still he could not determine how to break it to his mother, being well assured that she would be quite resolved to prevent him going. One day he told her boldly that he must take a journey up the Beanstalk. She begged he would not think of it, and tried all in her power to dissuade him, saying that the giant could not fail of knowing him, and would desire to do no better to him than to get him into his power, that he might put him to a cruel death in order to be revenged for the loss of his hen. Jack, finding that all his arguments were useless, pretended to give up the point, though resolved to go up at all events. He had a dress prepared which would disguise him, and with something to discolour his skin, he thought it impossible for anyone to remember him. In a few mornings, after talking with his mother, he rose very early, put on his disguise, changed his complexion, and, unperceived by anyone, climbed the beanstalk. He was greatly tired when he reached the top, and very hungry. Having rested some time on one of the stones, he pursued his journey to the giant's mansion. He reached it late in the evening. The giant's wife was standing at the door as usual. Jack spoke with her, at the same time telling her a pitiful tale, and requested that she should give him something to eat and drink and a night's lodgings. She told him what he knew before full well concerning her husband, and also that she, one night, admitted a poor, hungry, distressed boy just like him, who was half dead with travelling, and that he stole one of the giant's treasures, and, ever since that, her husband was worse than before, and used her very cruelly, continually shouting at her, with her being the cause of his loss. Jack was at no loss to discover that he was attending to the account of a story in which he was the principal actor. He did his best to persuade the good woman to admit him, but he found it a very, very hard task. At last she consented, and as she led the way, Jack observed that everything was just as he had found it before. She took him into the kitchen and hid him in an old lumber closet. The giant returned at the usual time, and walked in so heavily that the house was shaken to the foundations. He seated himself by a good fire, saying,
"I smell fresh meat."
The wife replied it was the crows who had brought a piece of carrion and laid it at the top of the house upon the leads. Whilst supper was preparing, the giant was very ill-tempered and impatient, frequently lifting up his hand to strike his wife for not being quick enough. She, however, was always so fortunate as to elude the blow. He was also continually shouting at her about the loss of his hen. The giant, at last, having finished his voracious supper and eaten till he was quite satisfied, said to his wife,
"I must have something to amuse me, either my bags of money or my harp."
After a great deal of ill humour, and having teased his wife for some time, he commanded her to bring him his bags of gold and silver. Jack, as before, peeped out of his hiding place, and presently the woman brought 2 bags into the room. They were of an immense size. One was filled with new guineas, the other with new shillings. They were both placed before the giant. He shouted at his wife most severely for having stayed so long. The poor woman replied, trembling with fear, that the bags were so heavy she could scarcely lift them, and concluded at last that she never could bring them downstairs, adding that she had nearly fainted owing to their weight. This so exasperated the giant that he raised his hand to strike her. She, however, escaped and went to bed, leaving him to count over his treasures by way of amusement. First, the bag containing the silver was emptied and the contents placed upon the table. Jack viewed the glittering heaps with delight and most heartily wished the contents in his own possession. The giant, little thinking himself so narrowly watched, reckoned the silver over and over again, then put it all carefully back into the bag, which he made very secure. The other bag was opened next, and the guineas placed upon the table. If Jack was pleased at the sight of the silver, how much more delighted he felt when he saw a heap of gold. He had the boldness even to think of gaining it, but soon, recollecting himself, he feared the giant would pretend to be asleep in order to get the better, to trap anyone who might be concealed. The gold was put up as the silver had been before, and if possible, even more securely. The giant snored aloud. Jack could compare his noise to nothing but the roaring of the sea and a high wind when the tide is coming in. At last Jack, concluding him to truly be asleep and therefore secure, stole out of his hiding place and approached the giant in order to carry off the 2 bags of money bought. Just as he had laid his hand upon one of the bags, a little dog, whom he had not perceived before, started out from under the giant's chair and barked at Jack most furiously. And Jack gave himself up for being lost. Fear riveted him to the spot, for instead of running, he stood still, though expecting his enemy to awake any minute. Contrary, however, to expectation, the giant continued in a sound sleep. The dog grew weary of barking. Jack, looking round, saw a large piece of meat, which he threw to the dog, who took it into the lumber closet, which Jack had just left. He found himself thus delivered from a noisy and troublesome enemy, and as the giant did not awake, Jack seized both the bags and carried them away. He reached the street door in safety and found it quite daylight. In his way to the top of the beanstalk, the only difficulty he had to encounter arose from the weight of the bags, and really they were so heavy he could hardly carry them. Jack was overjoyed when he found himself near the beanstalk. He soon reached the bottom and immediately ran to seek his mother. To his great surprise, the cottage was deserted. He went from one room to another without being able to find anyone. But then he went out into the street, hoping to see some of the neighbours, who could inform him where he might find his mother. An old woman said she was at a neighbour's, ill of fever, and directed him to the house where she was. He was shocked on finding her apparently dying, and could scarcely bear his own reflections on knowing himself to be the cause. On being told of his return, by degrees she revived, and began to recover gradually. Jack presented her with his 2 valuable bags. They lived happily and comfortably. The cottage was repaired and well furnished, and for 3 years Jack heard no more of the beanstalk. But he could not forget it. Though he feared making his mother unhappy, she would not mention the beanstalk, lest it might remind him of taking another journey. Notwithstanding the comforts Jack enjoyed, his mind dwelt upon the beanstalk. He could not think of anything else. It was in vain endeavouring to amuse himself. His mother found that something preyed upon his mind, and wanted to discover what the cause was. But Jack knew too well what the consequences would be if he was to tell her the cause of his sadness. He did his utmost, therefore, to conquer the great desire he felt for another journey up the Beanstalk. However, finding the inclination grew too powerful for him, he began to make secret preparations for his journey, and, on the longest day, arose as soon as it was light, ascending the Beanstalk, and reached the top with some trouble. He found the road, the journey, and everything else, much as it had been the 2 former times. He arrived at the giant's mansion in the evening, and found his wife standing at the door. Jack had disguised himself so completely that she did not appear to have the least recollection of him. However, when he pleaded hunger and poverty in order to gain admittance, he found it very difficult indeed to persuade her. But at last he prevailed, and was concealed in the copper boiler. When the giant returned in the evening, he said,
"I smell fresh meat."
But Jack felt quite composed, as he had said so before, and was soon satisfied. However, the giant started up suddenly, and notwithstanding all his wife could say, he searched all around the room. While this was going on, Jack was terrified exceedingly, and ready to die with fear, wishing himself at home 1,000 times. But when the giant approached the oven and put his hand upon the lid, Jack thought his death warrant was signed. The giant ended his search there, without moving the lid of the copper boiler, and seated himself quietly. This fright nearly overcame poor Jack. He was afraid of moving, or even breathing, lest he should be heard. The giant at last ate a great supper. When he had finished, he commanded his wife to fetch down his harp. Jack peeped under the copper lid, and soon saw the most beautiful harp that could be imagined. It was placed by the giant, and he said,
"Play, play."
And it instantly played of its own accord, without being touched. The music was very fine. Jack was delighted, and felt more anxious to get the harp into his possession than either of the former treasures. The giant's soul was not attuned to harmony, and the music lulled him off and into a sound sleep. Now, therefore, was the time to carry off the harp, and the giant appeared to be in a more profound sleep than usual. The harp was really a fairy, and as soon as Jack touched it, it called out loudly, "Master, master, master!" The giant awoke, stood up, and tried to run after Jack, but he had drank so much that he could not stand. Poor Jack ran as fast as he could. In a little time the giant was sufficiently recovered to walk slowly, or rather to reel after him. Had he been sober, he must have overtaken Jack instantly, but, as he then was, Jack contrived to be the first to the top of the beanstalk, the giant calling to him all the way that he went,
"Come here, come here, come here, you thief, thief."
and sometimes he was very near him. The moment Jack set his foot on the beanstalk, he called for a hatchet, an axe, and one was brought directly by his mother. He soon reached the ground. Just at that instant, the giant was beginning to come down. But Jack with a hatchet cut the beanstalk close off to the root, which made the giant fall into the garden, and the fall killed him. Jack's mother was delighted when she saw the beanstalk destroyed. He heartily begged his mother's pardon for all the sorrow and affliction he had caused her, promising faithfully to be very dutiful and obedient to her for the rest of the future. He proved as good as his word, and was a pattern of affectionate behaviour and attention to parents. His mother and he lived together a great many years, and continued to be always very happy.
I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Jack was the laziest boy the world has ever seen. He swapped a cow for a handful of beans. His mother was angry, so the beans she threw. With sunshine and rainfall, the beans grew and grew. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Jack was curious, so up the stalk he climbed. He kept going up, never knowing what he'd find. A cloud rode a castle and a giant's wife, lost on a journey that would change his life. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Fee-fi-fo from an Englishman's blood, the greedy giant roared, he was up to no good. Jack took his golden coins, his hen and his harp. The monster chased him with a sword so sharp. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. The giant's terrible reign had to be stopped, so with a sharp axe the beanstalk he chopped. The giant tumbled down, no more to scare, so happily ever after Jack lived without a care. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Jack was the laziest boy the world has ever seen. He swapped a cow for a handful of beans. His mother was angry, so the beans she threw. With sunshine and rainfall, the beans grew and grew. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Who, where, what, why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. When I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start. Why, don't forget when. I'll tell you a story I can't wait to begin. I'll tell you all my feelings and senses from the heart. I'll tell you Jack's story I can't wait to start.